Oh, I'm going to start recording. Do you have any beginning invocation blessing that you would like to do just to help to ground energy?
Ooh, I hadn't thought about that.
And if you're good, you're good. That's
I
okay
mean, I
too.
think no. I mean, I think I'm okay. Like that was really great. That was
Good.
really beautiful. I definitely in the space.
Okay, awesome. Well, so I wanted to welcome Julia Midland to our podcast, Real Eyes, Realize, and to introduce Julia today. First of all, she has worked in international policy and humanitarian aid for over 15 years. And so we're excited to talk to her more about her specialty in gender and conflict and working across numerous sectors, for everything from education to humanitarian assistance, governance, health, and counter-trafficking, illicit finance, and counter-terrorism. She's worked across the globe, particularly in conflict and post-conflict environments such as Somalia, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and has given her, and this has given her an acute understanding of the problems with the typical aid model and insight into how to make developmental programming more sustainable through equitable, community-centered intervention. She's the founder of OMPowerment Project, a nonprofit dedicated to empowering individuals in marginalized and at-risk communities worldwide. And we'll be finding out more about the OMPowerment Project during this interview. We're so excited to find out more about the sparks behind this important organization and this a lovely woman, and as well as finding out some of the pivots that have been made during COVID time. I came to know Julia through her leadership in a training program that she was hosting called Sustainable Service, Delivering Community-Centered Programming. And this was a virtual course where Julia brought her straightforward approach and her knowledge-based experience for really spotlighting an approach to conscious activism in the world. And I am so honored to have her as a guest on this podcast today. So thank you, Julia, for joining us, and I can't wait to dive in. Welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be here. And also so humbling to hear your bio read back to you. I mean, it's my life it's obviously my experience, but to hear it in words when other people say it is a whole new experience. So
Yeah, well, and I think this whole podcast, what we go into is the lenses and the mirrors that we have all around us. And so it's beautiful to reflect that back to you, all of your hard work. And as you know, Realize is all about people creating positive ripple effects in their communities and at the world at large. And so I'm really curious about the communities that you care so deeply about and how you got started. You've been at this over 15 years. So what's the story behind the why?
God, it's such a good question. I'm incredibly fortunate to have had the opportunity throughout my entire life of living and being in communities throughout the world. So I was born in and grew up in China
Yeah.
until I was 7, and this was back in the day. China was still poor. It's a very different country than it is now. But because we lived in developing countries, I hate to use that term. I just want to name that. I just can't, in this moment, can't think of you. Sometimes people use global north, global south, but I don't actually like any of the terminology around it. So I will just say, I guess, developing economy countries. But because I was growing up in these spaces, I was really lucky in that, from the beginning of my first memories are of not me being in the dominant culture and not me being the dominant face in the room.
Yeah.
I went to Chinese school. When we went on vacation, it was to places where there weren't a lot of other white people. And so I think, from a really young age, I'm really blessed to have had really an acute understanding that the world was bigger than just me. And it was bigger than my quote unquote home culture.
Yeah.
And that there was so much to learn from the communities that I lived in, and so much to learn just from the experiences that I had that were outside of what was called my culture.
Sure.
And that made a huge imprint on my life. I mean, that's literally where this all began. And my parents have always been really interested in service projects. So it was, I remember planting trees as part of the Great Green Wall, and, just being in these being in service projects, having been raised by parents who really felt that it was their duty and my duty as a white American to use that positionality, that social positionality, in a way that helped to disrupt the systems that kept us at the top. And this is something that, I know a lot of us are talking about now. I never had the words as a 7-year-old for privilege or white supremacy, but even in, even in Beijing in the early 80s, where I was the only white kid, there was still something about me. And now I can identify that as whiteness that still made me different, not just because of the way I looked, but made me sort of elevated in some strange way. And I could always feel that, even though I didn't know what it was.
Sure.
And so that, again, combined with parents who like really sort of pushed for us to get out into the world and to experience and to volunteer, and to not just volunteer in a way that it was like giving things to people, but to like really try and disrupt the systems and speak out. Really laid the foundation. Like I really can't, for most of my childhood, I wanted to be a doctor, but really like looking back on it, there was no other career choice for me, right? Like this was always what I was going to do. Right. I just didn't know it until like, for a really long time.
But you were like born into this, here you are, and this is your path. I love that.
Absolutely. I mean, and it's the only career I've ever had. I've been in different phases of this particular work. I've worked, like I said, like you said, I've worked in policy, and I've worked in, in direct field work, and I've worked in evaluation and all these different sort of facets of the work, but it's always been this international development focus.
Sure. What comes to me now, because I know how much, like you said, if you grew up with this, and there had to have been, I'm sure, a multitude of individuals, a particular person or a family whose story made a lasting imprint on your heart, whether or not it's what they've had to overcome, or that gives you that deeper sense of purpose for why you're doing what you're doing. Anything come to mind?
It's this is gonna sound maybe. The first thing that comes to my mind, honestly, is really like the first time I can remember understanding that we have things that other people didn't. And that was because we had a nanny. I had a nanny through when we were in China. My parents were diplomats, so they were traveling all the time. And so my nanny wasn't just like there for a day a week. She was like my mother.
Yes.
And I remember one day she took me to her home. And this has really stuck in my mind because I must have been 4, but it is a very vivid memory for me.
Sure.
And it was, a traditional old Chinese hutong where, you have multiple generations that are all living in the same structure. And it's generally a square space with a courtyard in the middle. And I remember seeing where she lived and somehow understanding that was what was normal in the culture that I was living in. And then returning to we didn't live in like a massive house or anything. It was an apartment, but it was still like an apartment in a diplomatic compound where I had a nanny. And we didn't live with my grandparents or my aunts or uncles. And so there was something about, when we left Beijing when I was 7, this was, before Facebook and all the things. So I have never spoken to her since, but that memory, I think, has really had a huge impact on my life, in the sense that it was that first time that I really, really understood.
Absolutely. Interesting. And so you kind of consider that a seed, maybe, that was in some way planted, that became this awareness that you've been able to massage and nurture and understand even deeper?
Yeah, I think so. So. I mean, I can come up with lots of stories from my travels around why I like focus on specific things, or why I've chosen like a certain type of work.
Yeah.
But I think that's really the very beginning.
That's wonderful. Well, what I'd love to know more about is, I know the OMPowerment project has such a manifestation for you. Talk about planting seeds and then taking a look at, how is it that you're able to bring that project to full fruition, and what is it that it's actually doing in terms of helping marginalized and or at-risk communities. So tell us more about how that got started, a little bit of the evolution of it, and what's going on with it today, here and now.
Sure. I mean, and this is a bit of a longer story, so
that's great.
Feel free to jump in and pause me at any time. But
okay, cool.
As you mentioned, I've been in this career for a long time, and there's an interesting thing about this type of work, which I believe is still a reality today in for a lot of organizations, which is that you know, you're in your early 20s, you're like just starting your career. If people like me especially are like willing to go and do all the risky things, right? Like my first field mission was to Afghanistan, right? And this was in 2005, right? Like legit, like we were literally at war.
Of action,
right?
yes.
And and I was like, yep, sure, sign me up, put me on the plane. You know, I mean, it's funny when you think back on things that you did when you were younger.
Right.
But the thing about this type of work is it's exciting, right? But nobody really prepares you for what happens in places like that. And you know, I feel like I was at more of an advantage than a lot of people because I had seen real poverty. And I had seen sort of that level of like what the rest of the world looks like. So that aspect wasn't shocking to me. And yet, right? You know, nobody, you know, I was taught how to carry a weapon and use a weapon. You know, I was taught how to be a good hostage and what to do if I was kidnapped and all these things, but nobody was ever like, oh, and by the way, make sure you get enough sleep. Because if you don't, you might not actually be effective at your job. Or make sure to take breaks and eat well. And, you know, all the little things that really are so much of a core component of self-care. And I don't mean like bubble baths and all of the things that actually do require money and access. I mean, breath, right? Connection to breath, literally just stepping away and taking a moment, right? Little things like that. Nobody ever really tells you how important that is. And so what happens, and I'm going to try and remember to speak from in my experience, even though I know it's more of a general and universal problem, like, because I can only speak for myself.
Yes.
But what I've seen is that there's a whole lot of burnout in this field, and especially in the aid world. You don't see a lot of 40-year-olds who are still in this work, and there's a reason for that. And it's because the job is hard. It's really hard, and it's really long days and really long hours and months on end without seeing your family and friends, and you miss everything. I've missed like most of my friends' weddings, the birth of their children, like all the things, right? Because you can't just hop on a plane from Khartoum.
Right. You're in the fields,
right. And it's hard, and yet it could be made so much better with just a little bit more, I think, training on the front end to sort of help people get into this work. So I name all this because I sort of survived that level of the work, in the sense that I was super burnt out in my mid 30s. Like I really was so disconnected from myself and my body, not paying attention to any of the signs that I needed to take a break, because I was stuck in a cycle of, well, if I take a break, someone's going to die, right? And maybe that's true in the place where I was working. Maybe that was true. I don't know. But it doesn't matter, because that's all that exists in your head. And so, you know, in that place, I put myself in a really dangerous situation. I was in Mogadishu in Somalia, and there was gunfire outside, and, you know, normally people would be like, oh my God, let me duck and cover and like hide under bed. And my body was like, let's go outside and see what's happening. You know, and it's like I can laugh about it now, but it's really not funny.
Not
right?
in
Like
the
my
moment.
life was put at risk, and so was the person who had to come and pull me back inside. And that was a real wake-up call for me. Thank God, right? Because if it hadn't been a wake-up call, who knows where I would have been. But it was a real wake-up call. Like I needed to do something, or I wasn't going to survive in this world, literally and figuratively. And so I feel really fortunate, because it was around that time in my life when my yoga practice was deepening and becoming a real yoga practice, right? I mean, I came into the yoga world through asana. I think a lot of people do. I wanted to like sit in chair and like do the hard things and sweat and, you know, get strong. And that's, you know, that's fine, but it's also not really yoga.
The foundations of yoga.
But because I've always been spiritual, like at some point it just sort of all came together for me.
I can imagine.
And luckily for me, it happened to be at around the same time that I was burning out. And like why all that happened to coincide, I will never know, but it did. And that changed the trajectory of everything that I did afterwards. So I was in a place of burnout, and I was able to recognize it because I had this deeper yoga practice. And I could, at that point, I could check in and say, I'm super dysregulated right now. I need A, B, C, D, E. I need to take a break. I need to connect with my breath. I need to, you know, consult a therapist, right? And that level of knowledge, of understanding what my body needed, allowed me to heal and get back into the work in a way that was stronger,
Mm-hmm.
with more resilience. But it also really opened my eyes to the reality that, all the tools that I needed, with the exception of a therapist, which
Right.
I don't want to like say that that's not important, because it really was for
But I
me.
know accessibility is really key for you in terms
Yeah,
of what's accessible to everybody. Yes.
absolutely. And
Mm-hmm.
for me, it was in addition to the therapist, it was, everything else was inside of me. Like I
Yeah.
had a connection to my breath. I could move my body. I could do all these things. And so these problems that I had sort of always, or I had been seeing, like the whiteness of yoga spaces, for example, became so much more prevalent to me, because
Mm,
I was living in London at the time, and I'd go back to London and I'd go into a yoga studio to practice, but I was surrounded by people who looked just like me, which was,
yeah.
like the thin, bendy white women. And then I'd go back into my work world and I'd be, sitting
Mm,
in women's circles with these incredible people who didn't look like that
yeah.
and didn't live in the UK. And nobody had ever given them this awareness that, like, to connect to the breath. And I
Yeah.
don't want to insinuate that I think that connection to your breath will save your life,
Mhm,
or
mhm.
like, or change, systemic oppression, right? And yet there's something about that level of awareness, and just the fact that it was available to some parts of the world and not
Mm,
other parts of the
mm,
world became so much clearer to me.
absolutely.
And also just really infuriating. So
So
um
there's part of you, what I'm hearing is you wanted to bridge the gap, but there's also this catalyst inside that was like, okay, so when I, am going through burnout, these are some things that helped me, and why aren't these tools available and accessible to others?
exactly.
And it
Exactly.
can be that easy to a certain extent.
Right.
So when you go into a community and you're looking to, teach the kinds of things around self-regulation, and how receptive are the communities? What do you find, and how sustainable do you think that is when you're in there and you may not be able to be in there for long periods of time?
Right. I mean, and these are really great questions, and they're also really central to what we do. So, again, I just want to reiterate that, like, these practices aren't going to change, like, the structures that have created refugees or feed people or clothe people, but
Yeah.
there has been so little focus on mental health in so many of these scenarios that it
Mm,
felt like the missing piece. I knew that I couldn't feed everyone in the world, but I felt like what I could do, my piece, would be to
sure.
bring these tools into communities, to at least give that one step,
Yeah.
like that one extra thing that wasn't there. But it was really important to me that it was done in a way that didn't perpetuate the hierarchy of
Yeah.
so much of the aid world already, which is top down. I'm going to come in, I'm going to give you something that you don't have, and then I'm
Yeah.
going to leave,
Right.
which is so prevalent in so much of the aid world. And that I had no interest in that.
Yeah.
I didn't want to be like a yoga teacher who came in and taught for a few weeks and then was like,
Mhm.
well, good luck with that.
One and
I'm
done,
I'm
gone.
back to London now. So it was really important to me in designing programming for these communities, that what we did was actually to go in and work with community leaders
Nice.
to tap into their own innate knowledge of the tools, because we all have an innate knowledge of
Yeah.
connection to breath. We just need to remember it.
Hmm.
And also tap into the power of the voice and the power of, like, those leaders within their own communities, the power of those leaders to know what their communities need in a way that I never will.
Hmm.
And so the
Because they're
purpose of
living,
empowerment,
breathing it. That's the, feet on the ground, living, breathing. This is what, yes, we're
yes,
handling.
100%. And so
Hmm.
the purpose of OMPowerment as an organization isn't to go in and teach yoga, or to teach, like, a tool, a training in tools for self-regulation. It's actually to empower community leaders with an embodied understanding of the tools. We do a lot of embodiment exercises so that they can then offer them to others,
Mm,
right? And I can leave, and the practices remain and are become
yes.
more sustainable, because there's no need for me to go back. These
Yes.
leaders have everything that they need within themselves. Now they remember it and they can give it to others, and then the ripple effect moves throughout the community, and more people can learn these tools.
Yeah. I would imagine it also grows in a unique way, depending on some of the cultural customs and depending on who the leaders are, and maybe adding some of their own, twists or their own kind of character or style. Do you go back, or do you hear from these community leaders? What does that look like to kind of see what happens after
Oh,
you started planting the seeds or started the ripple.
It's so beautiful. Like we see it just in the trainings that we do, because
Awesome.
everything we have sort of a base model, a base methodology, but every training is different in the sense that we're always co-creating the space with the communities that we're working with, right?
Mm.
So if I'm going to Kenya, I happen to have spent a lot of time in Kenya, so I know a little bit about the communities there. And so in that space of co-creation, I know that one of the things we want to include is a lot of like song and
Yes.
dance and, bring in the drums and, whatever they want. But
Yes.
there's that aspect of co-creation in all of the communities that we work with, so that it's not just us coming in, but we're working with them to understand
Yes.
what they want and what they need to then design the training that way. And so, yeah, you're right. Like everywhere it looks different. There's always, there's song, or there's art, or there's dance, and there's
Yeah.
just different ways of viewing.
That's it.
And
Yeah. And
we haven't
expressing.
actually, sorry.
No. I'm just saying it's like expression, right? And expression has so many different tones. It's like, when you take a look at the color wheel, it's like multiple different shades of so many different colors. And what a beautiful way for us to look at that, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we haven't had the opportunity to physically go back to any of the communities that we originally worked in. It was our intention to do so in 2020. And I know we'll talk about the pivot later, but we were going to go back to Kenya. And so our purpose for going back would be to follow up. I mean, we have a certain amount of ability to follow up without physically going back, because we have engagement with community leaders on the ground that can
Sure.
let us know how things are going. But our real reason for wanting to go back is to then run a second training and have those who went through the first round assist us, so that they're then building their capacity even further.
Makes sense. Yeah.
And we were meant to do that in Kenya this year, and then COVID. So
Yes. Yeah.
we were meant to do it in Myanmar as well, and COVID.
Yeah.
So it's something that we still plan to do.
Exactly. It's just like post-COVID. We've got to find a time where that feels right.
Yeah.
I do want to get into that. I do want to talk about that pivot that's happened. Before though, I'm curious, because you talked a lot about like your growing up and what you saw when you were 4, and kind of the whole thought about, and I know from just hearing you talk, there is a real differentiation that you talk through between equity and inequity, equality and justice. And so I'm curious what your perspective is, if you could share that with our listeners. And how does that tie into, you mentioned like typical aid models that maybe are not as well equipped to be able to take a look at sustainable, community-led, like organizations. So tell me what your thoughts are about the future. Like, how do you take a look at that whole difference between, again, inequity or inequality, equity, justice, and then what's possible?
Yeah, and the model that I love to show, and I know you saw it in the course, but maybe we can add it to the resource page actually just as an image.
Sure, absolutely.
Is the one of, and some people may have seen it, but there's 3 images that flow one after the other. And the first is there's a fence and there's a baseball game being played behind the fence, right? And there are 3 individuals. One individual is tall enough to see over the fence so he can see the baseball game. Another person is too short to see over the fence, but maybe like a foot too short. And then the third person's in a wheelchair. So only the tallest person can see over the fence. And that's the depiction of like the reality of the world that we live in at the moment. And so
that
then
would be maybe tagline inequality, like that there's, yeah, kind of to a certain extent. It's like,
right, exactly.
Starting point's different.
Exactly. And so then the equality model would say, okay, we see that there's this problem. What we're going to do is we're going to give everybody equal resources, right? Which sounds like a beautiful thing, right? Hand everyone the same book, or hand everyone a basket of food, or like the Finnish baby basket model, which actually I really love, that every child who's born gets a box with enough supplies to take care of the child for a year. Little things like that, like they're great, and they're well-intentioned and they're beautiful. But what happens is if you think of that image again, now everybody has a box. So the person who was tall enough to see in the first place, now he's just like basically able to jump over the fence, Right. The person in the middle who is too short, he can see over the fence, but the person in the wheelchair still can't, right? So we didn't actually fix anything. All we did was give everyone the same thing.
Yeah.
And that didn't make any difference for the person who could already see, right? So now they just have more stuff. And it also didn't help the person in the wheelchair to actually see the baseball game over the fence. All it did was elevate that person in the middle. So what we try to focus on instead is models of equity and models of justice, or liberation. And what those models are would be allocating resources based on need. So the tall person, he doesn't need anything. He's fine. So there's no sense in allocating a resource to this person. The person in the middle, he or she just needed the one box. So that's great. Give them the one box. The person in the wheelchair needs 2 boxes and probably a ramp to get up on top of the boxes in the first place. So let's do that. And then in that way, now everybody can see the game. Everybody can see over the fence. Everybody needed different things, but the end goal of sight was achieved. Right. And that's sort of the model that we like people who work in community-centered programming tend to work with right now, because it's what we can work with at the moment.
Yes.
A model of justice or liberation would be removing the fence entirely, right? So
remove the barrier, remove whatever it is that's separating. Yeah.
Sorry, Ryder wants to say hello to the people outside.
That's all right. Hi, Ryder.
And that is a beautiful model. We love the liberation model, and we should all of us should be striving for it. But it's what that is going to take is like really an upheaval of systems, right? That's systemic change. That's change at the government level, change at like the global policy level. And so it's just a lot more work, and it will require a lot more of us. I'm not saying that it's not worthy work. We should all be doing it.
Yes.
But in the meantime, we're focusing on equity to at least make sure that people are in the same place.
Yes.
And
discernment on resource allocation. It sounds like that's really key. Let's take a look at the challenge that we have in front of us, and let's really be smart about how these resources get allocated.
Right. And that moves into then sort of the sustainability model that you had also mentioned, which is that it's not just about going around and making sure that everybody has enough food to eat, right? Yeah. We could go around, I'm in Los Angeles right now. We could go around to LA and just hand out food every single day so that people had food to eat. And so great, like now everybody has food to eat, but what happens tomorrow? And what happens the next day? And why would we want to create a system in which the people who don't have enough food to eat are always going to be dependent on us showing up? What happens if I'm sick and I can't go, And so the goal for us at OMPowerment, the goal in the work that I try to do in the aid world is more around community-centered programming that focuses on the innate skills within that community to actually like take care of itself. And everybody has that, right? But because of the global misallocation of resources being access to healthcare, access to education, in this country, in the US, it goes back to colonialism and slavery and, poverty and incarceration and all these other systemic issues, right? That require a different lens into the solution. And so the solution is more about empowering people to do this themselves, teaching a man to fish, if you will, instead of just handing him the fish.
Yeah.
I love that. So that's where we are with like sustainable service and conscious activism is we're always going to make mistakes. We're all going to mess up, but if having the intention to work in that space, that will eventually lead to a larger disruption of the systems.
And is that when we talk about hopes for the future, is that really what you see is how can we do and let's work on equity models because it's something we can do. And let's take a look at how do we partner with governments, with NGOs, with regards to the justice model or liberation, or are you more focused on the equity and that's your piece and other people do justice?
I mean, I think that my piece in terms of what I'm offering the world is in the equity model with the hopes that then by giving people the space to reconnect to their own voice and their own power, that will eventually, that will lead to more systemic change. Anyone who's listening to your podcast, who's an activist, I'm sure that you are with me. I'm not sure. I imagine you're with me in like the frustration that sort of felt with like the hashtag waves and like, things becoming popular for a minute. Let's just name it like Black Lives Matter becomes popular for a minute. And then there's a new hashtag and everyone forgot that they were supposed to be anti-racist. And, that's the reality. And for as long as I've been working in this world, I've seen it and I've seen it happen over and over. And so we need to remember that like the work isn't done because the hashtag changes, right? And so there is a part of me that feels like my work isn't cut out to constantly remain in that space because it's so frustrating. And I'm not saying like I have a lot of respect for the people that are in it. I want to do everything I can to support them so that they can stay in it, while also talking to people about the importance of being in it.
Yeah.
And hoping that that is like my piece in helping to
And from back to what you said earlier too, caring for the people that are in it, so that when we're taking a look at, not getting burned out as quickly, being able to continue to be in that creative mode of like what's possible. It's a much different feeling and sensation than moving into feeling constricted and weighed down. Much more of, I'm sure, the creative ideation happens.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
can you think about a community that, maybe there's some sort of I don't know, like a visual that you can give us in terms of what one of the communities has done, a leader that has just really felt into the sense of empowerment, and what their progress has been.
Oh, I have so many. But I'm going to share one that directly relates to something else I'm going to talk to later. So
Awesome.
we led a training in a camp called Malakasa in Greece. It was the last training we ran actually before COVID. So it was in November of 2019. And it was a group of Afghan women. And one of them, I believe I can say her name because she's on our YouTube site, Zahra, has like really, really sat with the material and really just like kept the manual and practice and continued to lead her community through all of the things that have gone on in Greece. I don't know if you know this, but like a lot of nonprofits were kicked out of Greece because the government changed the rules around who could operate. And so there have been a lot of problems there, even as the refugee community continues to grow. And Zahra has been so engaged, and now she has actually led several practices in Farsi for our YouTube site, awesome. And like has taken on that role of like really leading people in grounding awareness activities, and so she's a really beautiful example. And that's somebody who's sort of taken the yoga role. I mean, we've seen other people. We have some of our trainees in Palestine who have gone on to like become leaders in leading a campaign to end child marriage. And so they're not necessarily like teaching self-regulation, but they found their voice.
Yes.
And
isn't that the spark that you are looking for, right? How is it that we create that spark? Oh, that's just incredible. Well, I'm sure that it has been a little challenging this year. Well, I don't say I'm sure, but you see that across the board, right?
It has.
And I know in your heart, like the feeling of wanting to go back to some of these places was really strong. So tell us a little bit about how you have pivoted with COVID, either what the challenges are or what you've really created as opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, we unfortunately had to make the decision to cancel our first training of the year like 3 days before I was supposed to fly. It was March 13th, like the day before LA went into lockdown. I was supposed to be flying to Brazil 3 days later, and we had been our intention had been to run two trainings in Rio de Janeiro, one with refugees and one with male survivors of addiction and homelessness. And so it felt really important to me, this work. It was going to be our first work in South America, and we canceled it because from our perspective, like it wasn't so much me being afraid of COVID, because we still didn't know very much about COVID at that point. It was more from this ethical consideration that like, well, what if I get it on the plane and then take it into a vulnerable community and start an outbreak? And that's a very real ethical problem.
Yes.
And so unfortunately we had to postpone all of our work for this year that was meant to take place there in Brazil and in Kenya and in Mexico and in Jordan and all of these amazing locations. And so the first thing that we sat with was, well, how can we continue to support these communities, right? There's still a need. And I'm going to be completely honest with you. A lot of the ways that seem obvious, we actually decided against. So we decided that we couldn't do things virtually for two reasons. First of all, because we're not therapists, and I don't know that a therapist would do this either. So I can only speak from my own experience, but I didn't feel like we had the scope of practice or the ability to hold a space virtually that had the potential to bring people into like traumatic memories or trauma responses, that we weren't there to then refer them onwards to therapists to make sure that they would stay safe.
Yeah, like you don't want to open the can of worms and then not be able to hold space and continue that progress.
100%. So that was our first concern. And then we also, there's logistical concerns. Like, we kind of take for granted that we can just hop on the internet on our phones, or that like a Wi-Fi outage is going to be fixed, right? And in a lot of the countries that I work in, take Kenya, for example, mobile data is very expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And so especially if you're working with refugees or survivors of trafficking, there's no guarantee that they have, even if I were to buy them mobile credit, right? The reality is that I would likely be creating a scenario in which they would gather together around one phone to access the work, because just because of the nature of how expensive data is. And that felt unethical to me.
Yeah.
And so we've been trying to develop an app that would have a ton of practices, as well as like a way to connect with each other, that we could like buy enough data credit for our community leaders to let them download.
Got it.
We have not yet been able to bring that to fruition. So this was something that we've like designed the whole thing. We have all of the things ready, but we need an app designer who will do it for us, because it's very expensive. So we're still working on that. We're applying for grants and trying to do that. But that was the best way we came up with to stay engaged with our local communities. And we're still working on that.
Got it.
In terms of what else we could do, the first thing that came to mind, the first thing that happened was that we got a request from a friend of ours who works within the NHS in the UK, who's a healthcare worker. And she was like, listen, we're all overstretched. Like, we can't, there's so many yoga teachers offering us free classes, but we can't dedicate 90 minutes at a very specific time. Like, we just need something we can do now. And so we had a request to create the YouTube channel. And what it is a collection of 5 to 60-minute resources that can be accessed anytime for free. And a bunch of it's like self-regulation practices. It's, shaking, 5-minute shakeout, or, stuff that anyone can do anywhere. You don't even need a mat or a large room. There's some guided meditations on there. And then what happened with that was very cool was, as we reached out to more and more members of our community, we started to get stuff in all these different languages. So now we have like French and Spanish and Italian and Arabic and Farsi, and it's just a really beautiful collection from that really reflects the diversity of our community and the beauty in our community. So that's available.
And that's available through your website, is that right? The OMPowerment project? Okay, we'll make sure to put that in speaker notes so that people will know how to access it, because it sounds like that's just an amazing set of resources.
Yeah, it's beautiful, and it also like highlights the work of other people doing this. So you can find a teacher and then go and find their YouTube site, for example.
I love that.
There's stuff for kids on there. I mean, it's really beautiful, and it's a living thing. So we're continuing to add resources as we get them. So that was the first way we pivoted. This was before we knew COVID was going to last the entire year. The next thing that we did was we've had a focus for several years on training facilitators in helping us to do this work. So we don't just train the communities, we also train people to come and work with us in the communities. And that has been very important for all the reasons I mentioned earlier. I feel an ethical obligation to not just bring a yoga teacher into a refugee camp. I think that that's harmful to both the teacher and to the community if the teacher has no idea about how they're showing up in space and what they're going to encounter and how trauma shows up in a space. So we have a facilitator training that we've been running for 3 years now. And we decided to devote a little bit more attention to that work, taking this time of COVID to really like help other facilitators to deepen their practice.
That's amazing. Just to be able to do this reflection and go deeper into the resources that you really think will have growing legs as you take a look going forward. Wow, that's wild.
Yeah, because the reality is when we come out of this, whenever that happens, the reality is that there are going to be more people who need access to this work, not less, right? I mean, we all, on some level, need access to this work, no matter how much we've been affected by this or not. So, we have several online courses that are available through our website. We don't have any dates at the moment for anything live, but everything that's online can be accessed and run, in your own time. For anyone who's not completely done with Zoom. or
Right.
the internet.
Well, we'll put some pointers to that too for our audience, because we really do want to make sure that we have, this is a resource rich, ability for us to really kind of see where everything is. And,
Sure.
what this really brings me to as we close this, is that something that you had said at one point in time that I just really love. And it's this thought that wellness should not be determined by geography, social status, ethnicity, access to finance, or privilege. And so it sounds to me like where you were at 4 and what you just discussed, even in the midst of this global pandemic, is really around access and the importance of wellness for all. And so
Absolutely.
I love that you walk your talk, girl. Like, I just
Oh,
love that you're out there doing this in the world. It's amazing.
thank you. And can I just name one more thing?
Please, absolutely.
So the other thing that we did this year is we launched the Speak Up Louder podcast. And I don't know if it's like cool to talk about a podcast on a
Please do.
podcast.
No, we wanted to talk about that. I noticed you had that going on. And like, I'm so excited. Speak
Look,
up louder.
any way we can support each other in that way,
Yes.
I think is great. And that podcast has come from since the beginning of us as an organization have wanted to elevate the voices of the communities that we serve. It's felt really important to me. I've met so many amazing individuals throughout my career, and I've heard so many amazing stories. And then it's funny, like then you hear them again, but like through a white voice at the UN, and you're like, wait a second, like I heard that 5 years ago in Malawi. How come, so there's that disconnect there because people aren't given a voice. They're not given a platform. And so through Speak Up Louder, what we wanted to do is elevate the stories of all of those that we serve who have a story they want to tell.
I love it.
Create that platform for them and create conversation around that platform. So in the season that was just released, we have a conversation with a woman who was a refugee that we met in Nairobi. She's a refugee from Democratic Republic of Congo who was recently resettled miraculously in the US. And so she tells a bit of her story, but then we also talk with people from Refugee where we met her, and people like my friend Hala Khoury who talk more about like the importance of this work. And so that's the other thing that has sort of happened for us this year.
You got some things going on, and this is what we're talking about, right? It's like, let's go ahead and create that spark that is the beginning. And I love, because this is where we are with this podcast too. It's elevating, amplifying the voices of the individuals that are out there, and realizing that, you don't have to be out doing, like you said, solving world hunger, that you can do things that feel like they are in your heart space in terms of capability. And so I just love that you've been able to offer that. Now, as we close this, we have a set of collective questions that we ask all of our guests, and it's just more like in the hot seat, super quick. Okay. So are you open to going through those?
I'm ready.
Okay. So currently, what are you currently reading or watching?
Oh my God. I hate to say that I'm not reading anything at the moment, because once I get off of computers, I can't look at more type. What I'm watching is the most recent season of The Crown.
Okay, that's awesome. Maybe that was back to your London days, right? Brings you back. So here's one. You have been all over the world. And so I'm curious, if you could eat a meal and have dialogue with anybody, past or present, who would it be?
Oh God, what a great question. I mean, Nelson Mandela is the first person that comes to mind. I think especially in this current political climate of the Biden administration coming in and me feeling a real sense of him needing to like find his inner Mandela to bridge the divisiveness in this country. It feels a little bit like a cheat of an answer, because I feel like most people.
I love it though.
Mandela, but
I love that thought about channeling your inner Mandela. That is a fantastic way to think about stitching things together, really working on, overall healing. So you've talked too a lot about wellness, and I'm curious, who supports you when you need a boost?
Community.
Community.
It's not an individual, but community. I have an amazing group of friends, and a lot of them are also healers. So that's
that is helpful. That's awesome. And last question, what are you most grateful for today, Julia?
I am so grateful that I am in a place, I have been for the last year in a place in this pandemic where I am safe, I am fed, I have a place to sleep, and I'm with beautiful, beautiful humans. So even though I can't see most other humans, the ones that I'm living with right now are really, really amazing. And I know that a lot of people don't have that right now. And I'm so grateful that I do.
Awesome. Thank you so much. You are such a treasure, such a gift. And we thank you so much for your time, Julia. I tell you what, it's just, I feel honored to have met you, and just really wanted to wish you also all the best. Keep safe, keep
Oh,
sane.
thank you
And
so much.
yeah, and so we'll put a bunch of links up to, the website and whatnot. We really want to make sure people know where to find you and how to support you. So is there anything kind of in that final little mode about how people can best support you, aside from having an app designer maybe call you and say,
Oh my
hey,
gosh. If
here
I
to
get
offer
an app
some help?
designer out of this podcast, you are my new best friend. Yes, if you know of anyone who's like starting an app design and wants to promote a project,
Yes.
but on a smaller level, we have a Patreon site that's for the price of a cup of coffee every month, you can support our programming as we move forward into this next year. We're going to be doing a lot more local programming within LA and in London.
Cool.
So that is restarting, and we do need support. Yeah, and just follow us on Instagram. Get sign up for our newsletter, stay up to date on what we're doing. We're always looking for new voices to join us and let us know what they think. So
Wonderful.
stay in touch.
Okay, that sounds like a plan, girl. Thank you. Have a
Thank
wonderful
you.
day. Take care of
Oh,
yourself.
you too. Thank you so much. I'm so honored to have been here.
Same here. Bye-bye.